did, but I don't want to take up all the time. So let's let Allison ask her question.
I really appreciate this focus on multiplicity, and it seems like it's a lovely way to end this conference. And I want to kind of just ask you all, because Armond, I'm familiar with your work, you know, feeling connected to the community, that you're also researching. Dr. Dana, you mentioned the same thing, Dr. Turpin.
My student, that might be, you call me Dr. Pat.
Dr. Pat, and I'm curious.
I don't want them to.
I feel
Don't want them to.
they probably do it because we don't want it.
That's true.
But I'm curious about collaboration among academics and how you see that as a similar or a different process, and if you all have experience with it, or I'm just curious. I don't know much about that process.
Well, did you want to speak, Paul?
No, I'm afraid that I tend to go into libraries and read books and think about them for years.
Is that collaboration? Like, this is my question. Like,
Sure,
what
why don't you
is
tell us about it?
Yeah.
They come to comments.
I do have a response to that, and it's connected to something you said about how you were feeling in terms of, I don't know if you actually used this term, but sort of the real activist. Did you use that phrase?
No.
You know, if I had to build credibility with among the people in the community, the people who are out, who don't have their, you know, cushy tenured job, you know, who are doing this work every day, rightfully challenged and were suspicious of me. And I've heard other of my colleagues, so Dottie Holland and I have had lots of conversations about this, you know, sort of that suspicion of academics coming to do their thing. And of course there's that long history, right? That's what the Decolonizing Project is all about, right? So we're trying to, I am trying to always work against that, and it's a constant thing. But it is nourishing to my soul to be in the presence and to work alongside people, and I learn so much from people who are doing this work, and I, you know, so collaborating with the people who are in community doing the work, and also my colleagues who are doing the work. I mean, you got to have someone who can speak your language and who, you know, is supporting it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just looking for like advice or like how we attend to this multiplicity within a field where we get coined as being in the ivory tower. You know,
It's true. So that's,
And it's not like our field itself has no issues that need to be addressed through activism. I mean, anyone who went through the experience of the unconvention in San Diego, where we had to take on the association because of its stupid ass decisions. But I mean, there's all kinds of fights. I mean, I don't know, some antagonistic within the discipline that organizing among. And in the academy, I mean, my goodness, around affirmative action and around so many other things, that as academics, we could look close to home for things to be activists on and not feel like the only activist research is like other people's activism.
So Chris and then Margot.
It actually kind of relates to some of Marlo's work from earlier as well, and your work on diversity, but I wanted to bring it back. So, bring it back to the business of the institution. So, a National Association of Scholars report got dropped about Bowdoin, Maine, or about Bowdoin College this week, and basically, you know, looking for identity politics courses. Lo and behold, it found identity politics courses. But there's been an editorial in a mainline paper about that every day for the past 5 days.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like, with the benefit of all your experience, I'm not so young or naive to know that there haven't been ongoing debates about canon or curriculum. But the rhetorical trick a lot of these editorials are trying to do is basically saying that you're teaching identity politics at the cost of being together in a multiplicity through a common canon of Western civilization or whatever. And for those of you not familiar with North Carolina, the Art Pope Higher Education Policy Center basically has been advocating this kind of thing for a while. So I'd like, with the benefit of all your experience to some of us students, just how have you kind of dealt with those ongoing challenges and charges of, you know, teaching too much of X at the cost of Y, and how possibly those get resolved at upper institutional dialogues or discourse? upper administrative or faculty kind of dialogues and discourses about curriculum.
You wanna start, Dana?
I don't know. I mean, I really think I'm talking too much.
No, you're not. I want to hear what you have to say about this. Because my answer is, I haven't yet, and I'm just waiting for it to be found out.
I think that's true, like, you can be a little bit under the radar sometimes.
Because I remember
But
these
I'm
debates
so
going back to the
Now you're under
90s.
the radar, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just refer people to my article on my hate mail, just kind of, I mean, to think, I always think about it in movement terms. There's a culture war that's been going on since the 80s that warrants the neoliberal war on public education in general and on higher education in particular. And that cultural war depends upon defining knowledge, legitimate knowledge, in an incredibly exclusionary way. And we're experiencing that by attacks at the University of Texas on our centers, on the area study centers, on Black studies, women's studies, and so on, where we know, a generation ahead of me at least, people at universities fought to have those centers, fought to have places where alternative knowledges could be created and theorized. And they're the first to go. I'll say one last thing. I'm on a committee that oversees disputes about promotion and tenure. It's an academic freedom committee. And you would not, in the College of Liberal Arts, 9 of the last 12 denials of tenure have been minorities that are affiliated with centers. And the basis of those denials is not at all quantitative in terms of the amount of work. There's just this really bogus discourse that is related to exactly what you're saying, of quality and rigor and sort of a canonical methodology. And it's infuriating because I also learned that I can't win within the system either. I mean, the committee, I was hamstrung in the committee. So, so we try.
Marla?
I think my question, comment builds on the past two things, but going back to this comment that you made a little while ago about activism within our discipline, so I'm like a non-traditional student. I started my PhD at age 40, and through the whole process have been so keenly aware of the disciplinary constraints that are both necessary to shape me as a scholar, and I'm very grateful for that, but also so frustrated and bounded by our scholarly discipline. And I would just like to rabble-rouse for a minute, maybe brainstorm some ways that we might bust these chains a little bit, because part of, and sort of going back to an earlier comment about methodology and whatever, and this issue of voice, and I just remembered, Pat, actually, that I read your chapter in the Reframing Differences book, and it was so effective to put yourself as a researcher directly in the spotlight of your own research. And so, we talked about there's all this criticism about being in the ivory tower and people don't connect to our work and are suspicious of academicians. And I think that's because we hide behind our, flowery language and our, distance from what we're doing. And so I think all of, I'm familiar with, David and Pat's work, but I think you provide a good example for that. And I guess I would call upon or see what you have to say, like leaders in our field who have the power and position to open up those spaces, as well as like the youth, not the youth, but like the new generation of scholars, and things that we can do to, bust it open. I think it's time. I'm sick. I'm just tired of the media scholars being over here and the polycom, how do we do this? Let's do it now.
Not to just take Paul's argument, but I think this is it. I think that these moments right here in these conversations are at least some type of starting point to get to what you're talking about, in terms of having various different people from various different parts of the country, different types of research, all sharing or speaking to something or some type of process that is somewhat similar, right, in various different ways. So I think that to some extent, that's, again, even though I didn't put that in there as a goal of this conference, to some extent, that was our thinking behind having this event.
Add it for next year as a specific goal.
But, so,
I'm sorry, there's a person in.
I was just gonna build on her comment.
But I want to make sure that you have time to.
Go for it.
I don't wanna stop rabble rousing it. Like, I mean, because I look at your work, Marlo, and you say, I wanna use these rhetorical terms, like, why can't we co-write dissertations? Like, I'm just,
Right.
like, I feel like you're talking about this type of structural change,
Oh, we do,
and I,
just over a minute.
and I just don't know if that's ever gonna happen because of the structures above the discipline. It's above the communication, right? It's the University of North Carolina.
Down.
I would say, I would think, so from, so Dana, you mentioned this earlier, I was gonna say earlier this week, okay, it was just yesterday. Yes, I know. So you were, I think it was you were putting in tension this notion of working in the concrete, I guess, and, so activism as a material endeavor versus the, sort of the chain of signifiers, right, the deconstruction process. So you put in that intention, but I see what you just recommended, what you just offered as an example of deconstruction, I think is the very project. I mean, I think let's go into that space. We're not going to throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater, right? People think that the deconstruction project is something that we can pursue in this conversation. So let's pursue it. So what would it look like to start to really disrupt and trouble some of the very categories that people hold on to? And Alex, this is your argument, right? That we are maybe I'm reading more into it than you intended, but sort of by building coalitions, we're sort of reifying the very structures that we're trying to work against. Was that kind of a little bit? Yeah. So it's oversimplified. But yeah, so I'm
What would
all
it look
for
like?
it.
ABD. It would look like like you wouldn't pass.
But if we, so that's my question. What's the project? So you can't give a social constructionist answer to a deconstructive question. You gotta say, no. What's the project? To me, that's the, and I think that there are possibilities there. There's work that can be done by shifting the ground, on which we are basing some of this, this thing that we're calling our social order that gets sedimented in,
Well, I just think there's different domains. I mean, there's the field, there's the university, there's the state, there's society at large, and different strategies are appropriate to each one, and they cannot be interchanged with one another.
Yeah.
And so I'm very okay with people talking about the deconstructive work in the intellectual domain. As I said last night, I think that if it dominates the social domain, then there are some limits because some kind of obstructionism needs to happen. And so I consider, this is not going to be a sort of a popular sentiment and maybe a moral failing, but I don't really consider my activism and my scholarship as the same thing, or even as always related to one another. So, yeah, because I have a theory, I theorize and look at history and kind of know what I think works in a particular domain at something, right? And so I go and do that, right? But it's not necessarily, but it was a joy to talk about it last night, but I don't think that the talking about it and being part of it are the same thing.
Yeah, the idea of solidarity has come up several times throughout the conference, and it's something that, after reading people like Argabadacharya and Chandra Mahante is really a complicated concept for me to wrestle with, and I'm just curious if you could speak to how solidarity gets complicated in these relationships. I think it's a word we say a lot, and we often are critical of that word and thinking about what it means, but I just am curious to hear kind of your reflections on solidarity and not navigating that process.
True, yes. So I put solidarity in conversation with this other space that I'm trying to interrogate. Like, what does it look like to be a collective and to listen to each other and figure out a way forward together? And so for me, solidarity brings up the question, it just gets us started at a particular level, which is to say, I have come to work with you. I have not come to help you. Right, if I just start with, I've come to work with you, that starts the conversation. Now, of course, you know, that, the assumption is there's a reason that you came, but that just begins the conversation. And so, I mean, and so this gets into that place. For me, it's so important in talking about working with people in vulnerable situations. So it has, to me, that's the thing that has to be the baseline of the conversation. And then, the other part of your question, I think, is related to what my book is about. Like, how do you negotiate that space of what power looks like, you know, I mean, this is the intersectional argument, right? So my identity, my declaring my identity, might be the very thing that is, you know, making you feel oppressed, right? And that's Mohanty's argument, right? Where Western women are talking about, oh, women are so oppressed, and it's reproductive rights, and let me tell you how you should do reproductive rights, because don't you know that you're in that patriarchal society and you just don't know yet, and let me teach you, right? And so, I mean, that's so oversimplification, but I think that's what you're
Yeah,
getting,
exactly.
right? So I think it's, you know, we're communication scholars. I always remember something that Fred Jablin said to me, not just to me, in our one of our seminars when I was studying at the University of Texas at Austin, so someone who's very, very near and dear to me. When we would get sort of into these spaces thinking about how to do a project, you say, always start with your communication sense, right? So thinking about discourse, our capacity for you know, for him it was about constructing meaning, right? What does it look like to construct meaning? But I think that's an answer to your question. That solidarity means it's this dialectical, discursive space that we are always working through, not out, but through. What's the question?
Yeah, thank you, first, thank you, Armond, for putting this together. But I just was kind of curious, just to touch on the intersections of the intellectual and the activist world, or conversely, where the activist enters back into the intellectual world. I mean, what I was sort of seeing with some of the art projects at the intersection of the sort of urban development questions in art was that it was innovating upon the forms in which normal development was taking place, and therefore it was producing certain ideals or values ahead of others. And in recent work that we've been doing in Greensboro is particularly looking at slowly working with these justice organizations and realizing that as makers we can innovate upon some of the basic communication tools and challenges that they're looking at, and to sort of create new spaces, and I find a need for new spaces in the sense that someone can say, well, I can come to the table as my full self, so it's a different kind of conversation that I can have inside this space that I can't have in others. And I know that a lot of the projects like Black Cinema House come from, well, the community churches aren't there in Hyde Park offering the resources we need, so we need like a kind of esoteric film space that everyone comes to and is engaging with. And there's a certain public intellectualism that's different than what was offered by the traditional spaces. So I'm curious again, sort of as the intellectual enters the activist space, or the activist comes back into the intellectual space, or maybe the intellectual coming back from the activist space re-enters the intellectual space. What sort of transferences are taking place that you find valuable, and that you discover a new role for these different positions in the respective different spaces? Yeah.
Can I say I stopped being a structuralist once I was an activist, because you know, structuralism posits obviously a structure that basically organizes consciousness and activity. And I mean, I was critical of neoliberalism and understand its structure and so on, but when you start listening to other people talk about agency and change and all the time, I mean, it's just, forget it. I had to change my entire theoretical apparatus. It didn't look like it did, but I really did.
For me, it's a great question, such a great question, and one that I want to think about more in the way that you put it. So I want to think more about it, but first of all, I feel fortunate to be in a place where I can do the work that I'm doing. And so, I mean, I wake up every day and I'm just so grateful that I am able to do unapologetically the work that I'm doing. So I think it is definitely the directionality of influence is more from the field through me to my intellectual space here in the academy, because I'm definitely learning so much more from the field than maybe I'm not. I'm not sure, but it seems that way. I'm getting that way. And then it's flowing the other way.
I don't know that this sort of addresses the issue of the public intellectual as you raised it, but when I said a few minutes ago that I go to a library and read books and think about them for too many years, what I'm trying to do, and this is what motivated me to, this is a second career for me, so I was a non-traditional student too, at 45. And what motivated me was I wanted to understand how people could sincerely think so differently from each other. And I was drawn to those really fundamental core beliefs and values about how people work, how what the nature of an economy is, what the moral, what the correct moral rules are by which we should treat each other and interact and all that stuff. So it does feel to me like, and I can't say at all that I'm an activist in the sense of the social movements that we've been talking about. It does feel to me like that my teaching is an important activity that I do, because just being able to bring students to some awareness of things like race and class and gender and sexuality is that little bit of movement. When I have a freshman for a semester and we spend the semester looking at media and looking at how images are presented and so on, that's important work for what it is. But what motivates me in my research and my intellectual work is that desire to, in the case of what I'm looking at now, to be able to try to say something about ideology in a functional sense. I want to say positive, but not exactly positivist. I want to know how people think, how they make their arguments, and to partly in an effort in the old rhetorical search for, is there common ground? Are there possibilities for making connection across holding different values or priorities or intention with each other?
2 minutes, folks. Last question. Who wants to claim it? All of your questions are just too complex and rich.
I just want Armand to answer my earlier question, actually.
Okay, tell it again.
I'm curious about how you interact with your field and your work as a scholar. Because you talk about, it's about voyeurism in some ways, so I'm curious about your positionality in that space.
Well, I think I have a different experience when I go into that space because, well, I am a former street gang member, and when I go into that space, the people are shocked that I am there. They have a very kind of, I guess, preconceived notion of a researcher, and when every time I've gone in, they've been like, "Yo, what's up, homie? I'm glad you're back." I'm not from there, but so I have a very different experience with my site than I think the average researcher does, and particularly they always tell me how they hate when they have to do newspaper interviews or television interviews because there's a stiff white lady who is terrified to talk to them, but I'm very happy that there's a camera on, just in case. Right? Yeah, I guess to some extent, that is very helpful for me, but at the same time, it's also very, it hurts me as well, right? Because, so like sometimes we'll be on the tour and like they'll like be talking about my game with the Bloods. They'll be talking about the Bloods and they'll, like one of the guys will turn to me and be like, did we leave anything out? And I'm like, like I become a part of the tour almost, right? Like I become almost a tour guide. I get pulled in. And of course, you know, like, I guess that's kind of the awesome thing, lets you know that, you know, you can never be like this disconnected researcher, right? So there's like this kind of tension, I guess, for me to kind of, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question or
Yes.
not, but that's kind of how I feel. I feel like I'm kind of back and forth between these two worlds.
To me, that's a perfect example of the multiplicity. We are not, if we think about like how we just wake up every day and engage the world, we're not in these little boxes and this part. I mean,
Right.
you've got all of these forces coursing through us, around us, and then we act as if we know what's going on. You know, we just really don't. And so I think that's a great example of that. You know, so like, how do we start there? The fact that our histories are always intersecting, you know. Where's Brett with the drugs? Oh, wait, and the camera is on.
Okay, on that note, this is the next one. I understand there's a happy hour.
Is it Linda's
Where?
Gym?
Sponsored by Brett.
It's really happy.
Where is
I think it's,
location?
It's underground?
Chapel Hill Underground?
Well, it's actually an email underground, but it's also going to text you, so we can go wherever we want.
Yeah, we couldn't do underground because.
Underground had to open early for us and we weren't sure of the numbers. So.
Oh,
So we.
Linda's, across the street.
yeah.